was the United States and Russia, Emmanuel. But interesting, the role being played here by another of those elements, China, which stood with Russia in this. And let's sort of break that down.
This is not surprising because China is openly challenging the post-World War II and post-Cold War US-led international order. It did so, for example, in 2016 when the International Court of Justice ruled against China on the issue of the South China Sea. So China is challenging this order, and it is looking very closely at Russia's moves in Ukraine because China, of course, has its own eyes on Taiwan. And if the U.S. doesn't stop a Russian invasion of Ukraine, obviously the Chinese will conclude that it is safe for them to move on Taiwan, which is very clearly the plan of President Xi Jinping. And so the two are related, and it's not surprising, therefore, that China is basically siding with Russia at the Security Council on this potential Russian aggression against its neighbor.
Right, maybe even more so after the U.S. pulled out of Afghanistan, which may have given Vladimir Putin the feeling he could act in this case. Of course, the Russians claiming it's all much ado about nothing, but you don't move over 100,000 troops onto the border of Ukraine at considerable expense and considerable organization, your military machine. But the question is, what will President Putin do? It's clearly his game. And do you have any sense, just examining the moves that have been made and the reaction, whether he's going to follow this game to its finish?
Look, Putin has described the end of the Cold War and the implosion of the Soviet Union as, quote, being the biggest geopolitical disaster of the 20th century. For him, the fact that the Soviet Union collapsed, the fact that former Soviet satellites in Eastern Europe and within the former Soviet Union itself, such as the Baltic state, became members of the European Union and of NATO is a humiliation. Russia never put up with this geopolitical change. And as far as Putin is concerned, first of all, the Baltic states, as I said before, were once part of the Soviet Union. They are now part of NATO and of the European Union. And then there have been talks for many years about the Ukraine joining maybe NATO or part of the European Union. And for Putin, this is a red line, because for the Russians, the Ukraine is part of Russia. That's how they see it. And therefore, he's using Ukraine as a test for the West. You mentioned before the retreat of the United States from Afghanistan, and Putin is testing the West. He wants to kind of reduce the NATO's presence on his borders, and he's using the Ukraine as a test study. And that's why the U.S. must be very firm, because, back in 1946, the U.S. diplomat George Kennan had written already back then what was the blueprint of U.S. foreign policy vis-a-vis Russia.
His famous containment
saying Russia's international behavior has never changed and never will. It doesn't matter if it's communist or not, and therefore it must be contained. And this is a very important test for the Biden administration.
Right. The question, though, is how far the Biden administration is willing to take it and what kind of compromises they might be tempted to make. Russia asking for some kind of security promise, for example, that Ukraine won't join NATO in the foreseeable future.
I think personally this is a commitment that the U.S. can make, that the Ukraine will not join NATO. I think that as it is, former Soviet republics, such as the Baltic state, joining NATO was already a bit too much for Russia. But as I said, they see Ukraine as part of the Russian Empire. And therefore, I think it is reasonable, personally, for the West and for the U.S. to commit that the Ukraine will never join NATO. But of course, that the U.S. will not cut its military presence within NATO, because it is unacceptable to accept Putin's demand to create two types of NATO. The NATO members that have a common border with Russia and in which the military presence of U.S. and Western troops should be cut, and the original members. I think it is unacceptable to divide NATO in two categories, but on the other hand, I think it is reasonable, to commit that the Ukraine will not join NATO, and that should be discussed, and I think this is really what Putin wants to achieve. And don't forget, he's already annexed Crimea in 2014, and this has gone without any real reaction besides economic sanctions from the West.
Well, we'll see how this superpower crisis plays out, Emmanuel. Dr. Emmanuel Navon, thank you for that.
Thank you.